July 2013. Costa Blanca, Spain. A quiet corner of the Mediterranean, known for its sunshine and luxury villas, suddenly became the stage for one of the most dramatic police takedowns in modern crime history. The man at the center was Brian Charrington. To some, he was nothing more than a car dealer with a knack for fast money. To others, he was a trusted police informant, working in the shadows to help investigators bring down criminal empires. But behind the mask was a different truth. Charrington wasn't simply passing on information. He was building his own empire, smuggling cocaine across borders and living like royalty in fortified mansions. Police described him as one of Europe's most wanted. His story wasn't just about drugs or money. It was about betrayal, survival, and the thin line between criminal and informant. A man who played both sides and believed he could never be caught. Brian Charrington's story began far from the Spanish coast, where he would later build his empire. He was born and raised in Middlesbrough, a working-class town in the northeast of England. At first glance, he didn't stand out. He worked as a second-hand car dealer, the kind of man you might pass on the street without a second thought. Selling cars gave him an appearance of legitimacy. It was a business that kept him close to cash, allowed him to meet all kinds of people, and provided a cover for the wealth he would later accumulate. But beneath this ordinary front, something else was taking shape. Charrington was ambitious, restless, and drawn to a life that promised more than what Middlesbrough could offer. The car dealership wasn't just a way to earn a living. It became a mask, a way to hide his growing involvement in the world of cocaine smuggling. He soon realized that the skills needed to run a dealership, negotiation, persuasion, spotting opportunities, could just as easily be used in crime. And with international contacts opening doors, Charrington began building connections that stretched far beyond his hometown. This shift was not a sudden leap. It was gradual, carefully managed, and calculated to avoid attention. To the outside world, he was still the car dealer with a steady business. But in reality, the cars were only a small part of his income. The real money was coming from shipments of cocaine, hidden and moved across borders with precision. The transformation was stark. In Middlesbrough, he was just another trader. In the underworld, he was becoming a key player. The man who once dealt in used cars was now dealing in millions. And while he still lived behind the facade of an honest businessman, he was quietly stepping into the role that would define his life: drug trafficker, informer, and one of Britain's most notorious criminals in the making. Brian Charrington's rise from a car dealer in Middlesbrough to an international trafficker was not a solo journey. His most infamous partnership was with Curtis "Cocky" Warren, the man once described as Britain's biggest drug baron. Warren was feared and respected across Europe, a criminal entrepreneur with a direct line to the Colombian cartels. When Charrington aligned himself with Warren, he stepped into the very heart of the global cocaine trade. The connection opened doors few British criminals could dream of. Together, they secured deals with Colombian suppliers, arranging shipments of cocaine worth tens of millions. But smuggling drugs across borders required more than contacts. It needed ingenuity. Their most audacious method involved hiding cocaine inside shipments of lead ingots. On the surface, these were legitimate industrial materials, heavy and difficult to inspect thoroughly. Inside, however, they carried a fortune in white powder destined for Europe's streets. The scale was breathtaking. Authorities later estimated that just one shipment could generate profits running into the hundreds of millions. Warren's reputation gave the operation power. Charrington's cover as a car dealer and his growing reputation as a police informant gave it protection. This double role made him untouchable. As an informant, he was feeding intelligence to law enforcement, shaping cases, and cultivating the image of a valuable source. But while one hand appeared to be helping police, the other was working with Warren to flood Europe with cocaine. The contradiction was staggering. He was the insider who knew how investigations worked, and he used that knowledge to stay ahead. By the early 1990s, the Charrington-Warren partnership was generating serious wealth. Villas in Spain, luxury cars, and the kind of lifestyle most could never imagine were all funded by cocaine money. Yet behind the extravagance was a dangerous truth. Warren's empire was expanding, and Charrington's duplicity was becoming harder to hide. The irony was striking. Law enforcement believed they had an asset in Charrington, while at the same time, he was helping one of Europe's most notorious criminals build a smuggling network of unprecedented scale. For a while, it seemed nothing could touch him. He had protection, wealth, and connections stretching from South America to Europe, but partnerships built on crime rarely last. As the shipments grew larger, and as suspicions began to circle, the fragile balance between informant and trafficker started to crack. And when it did, the fallout would shake both sides of the law. The most remarkable part of Brian Charrington's story was not his wealth, or even his partnership with powerful criminals. It was the paradox at the heart of his life. He was both an informant and a drug trafficker. To police, he appeared to be an insider, someone feeding them valuable intelligence. To the underworld, he was a trusted partner, moving shipments worth millions. In reality, he was both, and that double role allowed him to escape justice time and time again. In the early 1990s, Charrington's position as an informant was tested in court. He and Curtis Warren were arrested in connection with one of their cocaine shipments. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but what followed was a collapse that stunned prosecutors. It turned out that Charrington had been working with law enforcement, and questions were raised about the way evidence had been gathered. The case against him collapsed, and while Warren faced years behind bars, Charrington walked free. This was not an isolated event. On more than one occasion, Charrington's status as an informant made him untouchable. Trials faltered because of procedural errors, questionable evidence, or the uncomfortable truth that police had relied on a man who was simultaneously running a smuggling empire. It was a scandal in itself. The justice system had allowed one of the biggest players in the cocaine trade to avoid conviction simply because he had been considered too valuable as a source. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. How could someone be trusted to give intelligence on drug operations while he was orchestrating them himself? Yet for years, this was the arrangement. Charrington provided just enough information to keep himself useful, all the while protecting his own shipments and profits. It was a game of survival, and he played it masterfully. Each time the law closed in, loopholes, errors, or his informant record shielded him. To some, he was a clever manipulator of a flawed system. To others, he was a traitor, betraying both criminals and police alike. But one fact was undeniable. The paradox worked. Charrington had managed to turn the system designed to stop men like him into a shield for his empire. And as long as it held, he seemed untouchable. By the mid-1990s, Brian Charrington had left behind the gray skies of Middlesbrough for the golden coast of Spain. Here, on the Costa Blanca, he built not just a home, but an empire. His villas were fortified, guarded, and fitted with the kind of security more often associated with heads of state than former car dealers. From these lavish bases, he ruled his criminal world like a king. Charrington's wealth was displayed in every corner of his life. Luxury cars filled his driveways, yachts bobbed in the Mediterranean marinas, and his properties looked more like fortresses than family homes. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was flaunting the riches that came from cocaine smuggling, and he did it with a style that made him notorious in Spain's underworld. His lifestyle became the stuff of legend. One story that circulated claimed he kept crocodiles in his swimming pool to ward off intruders, a tale that blended fear with extravagance, perfectly reflecting his public image. True or not, it added to his aura of danger and power. To the authorities, he was a criminal in plain sight. To his neighbors, he was the mysterious Englishman with more wealth than they could comprehend. Charrington also cultivated an image of glamour. His family appeared in gangster-themed music videos, posing with fast cars, expensive clothes, and symbols of wealth. It was more than just entertainment. It was a statement. He wasn't running from his reputation. He was embracing it. He wanted the world to see the life he had built, a life that mixed crime, luxury, and notoriety. But behind the gold and glitter lay a reality of constant risk. Living openly as a drug trafficker in Spain required more than money. It required influence, connections, and an iron grip on his empire. Charrington had all three. His knowledge of how police and prosecutors worked, combined with his ties to cartels and criminal networks, gave him the confidence to act untouchable. The Spanish years were his peak. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. From fortified villas and guarded pools to fast cars and public displays of power, Charrington had transformed himself into something few criminals ever achieve, a figure who lived like royalty while still sitting on the front line of the drug trade. But as with every empire, questions lingered. How long could this illusion last? And when it fell, how spectacular would the collapse be? By 2013, the scale of Brian Charrington's empire had grown beyond anything the authorities could ignore. His name was no longer just whispered in the underworld of Spain or England. It was appearing on the desks of police chiefs, border officials, and international task forces. The man who once sold used cars in Middlesbrough was now commanding shipments of cocaine worth millions, moving across oceans and continents with military precision. The pressure against him was mounting. For years, Spanish investigators had monitored his movements, tracing his ties to Colombian cartels and Venezuelan connections. They knew this was not the work of a lone trafficker. It was a network, vast and sophisticated, built on bribery, coded messages, and layers of front companies. British intelligence passed their own files across to Spain, and slowly, an international operation began to take shape. Then came the turning point. In 2013, Charrington was arrested in Spain in one of the country's most significant anti-drug operations of the decade. The raids uncovered 200 kilograms of high-purity cocaine, a haul valued in the tens of millions. His fortune was no longer hidden. Authorities seized luxury villas, high-performance cars, and offshore accounts, stripping away the facade he had built so carefully. For a man who had once seemed untouchable, the fall was dramatic. But what shocked many was not just the size of the seizures, it was the sheer reach of his dealings. Evidence tied him to shipments crossing from South America into Europe, with Colombian and Venezuelan sources feeding his supply lines. The same man who had once cooperated with British law enforcement was now coordinating with some of the most dangerous cartels on Earth. For Spanish prosecutors, the case was clear. Charrington wasn't simply another trafficker. He was a key node in the global cocaine trade, with power and wealth stretching across continents. His arrest made headlines across Europe, described as a triumph of joint operations between Spain, Britain, and South America. And yet, even as the cocaine was stacked on tables for photographs and his assets catalogued, one question lingered. How had a man who once worked as an informant for the British police risen so high only to be brought down in such spectacular fashion? Brian Charrington's criminal career was not defined only by drug shipments and fortunes made. It was also shaped by a long series of courtrooms, judges, and verdicts that often seemed to bend in his favor. His life became a cycle of arrests, trials, and sudden escapes from justice. One of the earliest turning points came in the infamous yacht case. Authorities accused him of using luxury vessels to smuggle large quantities of cocaine. Yet, despite the evidence, the case crumbled under legal pressure, leaving him free once again. It would not be the last time prosecutors struggled to make charges stick. In Leeds, another high-profile trial collapsed, leaving serious questions about how a man so deeply tied to the drug trade could repeatedly slip away. The pattern was clear. The higher the stakes, the greater the chance that something in the courtroom would fall apart. But he wasn't untouchable. His dealings eventually caught up with him in Europe. Charrington was extradited to Germany, where his operations had left a clear trail. Later, he would face prison terms in both France and Spain. These sentences marked rare moments when the law managed to hold him, though never for long enough to dismantle his empire. Then came 2018, a year that seemed to finally bring him down. A Spanish court convicted him on serious trafficking charges, and for once the weight of the evidence looked impossible to shake. Yet even here, the story took another twist. Spain's Supreme Court ordered a retrial, citing impartiality issues in the original proceedings. It was a stunning reversal, one that reopened the door to yet another escape. For prosecutors, the frustration was immense. Time after time, they believed they had their man. Time after time, the system seemed to hand him a way out. For Charrington, the courtroom was not just a place of judgment. It was a battlefield, one he had mastered as well as the smuggling routes that made him rich. The question remained, how many times could a man face the law only to walk away again? He was once a man who moved millions in cocaine, who played both sides of the law, and who lived a life of luxury behind high walls. But in the end, Brian Charrington's empire crumbled. His later years were marked not by power or influence, but by decline, isolation, and strained ties with those closest to him. The same wealth and reputation that once shielded him could not protect him from the passage of time. By his late 60s, Charrington was living in Spain, far removed from the scale of smuggling operations that made him notorious. Age, health, and constant brushes with the law had eroded the aura he once carried. His family relationships grew fragile, weighed down by years of secrecy, scandal, and betrayal. For someone who thrived on control, these final chapters were marked by loss of it. In 2025, at the age of 68, Brian Charrington died in Spain. His passing closed the story of a man who had once been both an informant and a kingpin, a man who had used the law as both shield and sword. For law enforcement, his name stood as a reminder of missed chances, failed prosecutions, and the difficulty of dismantling international drug networks. For the media, he remained a symbol of contradiction, someone who manipulated the system and lived lavishly, only to end his life in quiet decline. Even in death, his reputation lingered. Some saw him as a cunning survivor who played the game better than most. Others saw him as a criminal whose luck finally ran out. Either way, Brian Charrington left behind a legacy of controversy, one that ensured his name would not be easily forgotten. Brian Charrington's story does not end with a single arrest or a final conviction. His legacy lives on, not just in the court records or police files, but in the strange and almost unbelievable way he shaped his own public image. He became known as the Wikipedia narco, a man who reportedly updated his own online biography even as law enforcement across the world was chasing him. It was more than arrogance. It was a statement, a reminder that he was always one step ahead, even in the digital space. But his infamy runs deeper than an edited web page. Charrington's life is a mirror held up to the darker side of justice. He was both an informant and a trafficker, a man trusted by police even as he flooded Europe with cocaine. His empire revealed not only the reach of organized crime, but also the cracks within the very institutions meant to stop it. The corruption, the betrayals, the courtroom collapses, all of it turned his name into a symbol of blurred lines. Was he a criminal mastermind, or a creation of a system too compromised to bring him down? The truth lies somewhere in between, and that uncertainty is what keeps his story alive. In the end, Brian Charrington remains more than a drug lord. He is a figure who embodies the contradictions of modern crime, the power of wealth, the fragility of law, and the uneasy marriage between criminals and those who hunt them. His story lingers as a warning, a reminder that in the world of crime and justice, the line between hunter and hunted is never as clear as it seems. So how should history remember Brian Charrington? Was he the calculating mastermind who played both sides, using his role as an informant to shield a vast criminal empire? Or was he simply the product of a system riddled with corruption and compromise, a man who thrived because those meant to stop him chose instead to look away? His life leaves us with more questions than answers. He lived like royalty on the Costa del Sol, dodged trial after trial, and even edited his own story while still on the run. To some, he was untouchable. To others, he was the ultimate example of how justice can fail. But in the end, one question lingers above all. Was Brian Charrington truly a master criminal who outsmarted the system, or just a pawn of corruption that allowed him to rise too far?